Yes, come right up to here, that's fine. I'm going to stand out the way, yes. I should stand very indecorously on top of this grave so you can all hear me. Are we all here? There, one behind there, okay. Can you all hear me? Is that okay? I know you can't all see, that's a bit of a problem, but if you want to come forward, that's not a problem. There's still a little bit of space here. If you don't know who the pre-Raphaelites were, they were a group of painters in the Victorian era, artists, young men, who completely went against the rules of artistry in that period, against the rules of the Royal Academy. They painted outdoors, they painted real faces, they were obsessed by medieval stories. They were considered outcasts, and their paintings were considered, their artwork was considered absolute rubbish. You could buy them then for a few pounds in those days. Try buying them now, you need to be a multi-millionaire, of course. One of the most famous is a man called Dante Gabriel Rossetti. Rossetti, of course, is an Italian name. You can see here, for those that can see, Gabriele Rossetti is the father of Dante. He was a political refugee. He had written inflammatory verses against the Archduke of Tuscany, and there was a death warrant issued against him. He had to flee Italy, came over here to this country, set himself up, and eventually became Professor of Italian at King's College in London, a very important, prestigious position. 4 children. 2 are very famous. Christina Rossetti, some of you may have heard of her. She wrote this wonderful poetry, Remember Me, Goblin Market, The Christmas Carol, In the Bleak Midwinter, Frosty Wind Made Moan. And her brother, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, one of the most well-known of the pre-Raphaelite group of painters. Now, this group of artists needed models. Models were very hard to find in the Victorian era, and they had particular obsessions about their models. And one of the obsessions was the models had to have beautiful hair. And not just any beautiful hair, in particular beautiful red hair. Why red hair? Red hair was a sign of very bad luck in the Victorian era, and they wanted to dispel this myth. So they would send their friends out looking for models. One of their friends was in the Leicester Square area and saw the window of a milliner's shop, people to make hats, a very striking young woman, tall, slim, but most important of all, she had this glorious copper red hair flowing over her shoulders. And as some of you will know, her name was Elizabeth or Lizzie Siddal. You couldn't just walk into the shop and say, "Hi, would you like to be a model for us?" Oh no, you sent your mother in to speak to the proprietress, etc., etc. She agreed to become a model, and as such, she was introduced to this very good-looking young Italian, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And the two fell in love, but Dante knew this was going to be a big problem. Why? He was the son of a very important, prestigious professor. She was a working-class girl. His family was not going to accept her. So they ended up having a secret love affair, living together at Blackfriars on the River Thames, the filthiest area of the river, where the stench coming out was so abominable that poor Lizzie became sick. Now I have to say, she didn't just suffer from physical problems, poor soul, she also had serious mental health problems. Well, Dante did try to help her, took her all over the place, even outside the country, but nothing seemed to help until she was introduced to a miracle drug that was going to cure all of her problems. Laudanum. Opium dissolved in alcohol. 10% opium, 90% alcohol, very strong stuff. Lizzie started taking it and she became severely addicted to the laudanum. So not only was she the equivalent of a nowadays supermodel, but actually she was also a drug addict. It has a slightly familiar ring, possibly. Well, eventually the two did get married in secret and Lizzie became pregnant, but sadly in the 8th month of her pregnancy she felt the baby had stopped moving, and indeed it was stillborn. And this was more or less the straw that broke the camel's back. What do I mean by this? Lizzie and Dante had what was called an open marriage. And that meant that Dante could run around with a few extra women. In particular, one of them, Jane Morris, William Morris, his wife, and then ex-wife, one of the pre-Raphaelite group. Very beautiful woman also. And that was causing terrible problems in their relationship. And this is true, were having awful arguments about this, not surprisingly. And one evening, after one of these arguments, Dante, it was a horrible argument apparently, picked up a bottle of this laudanum. He knew she was taking it, threw it at her and said, "Drink the whole lot," and he walked out the door. Lizzie looked at that bottle and she drank the whole lot. And he came back an hour and a half later, found her unconscious, and despite having her stomach pumped, they couldn't revive her. She died. In fact, she had committed suicide, and yet she's buried here in this grave on consecrated ground. Well, you're not supposed to bury suicides on consecrated ground. How do you get over that? Well, they adapted the verdict to say it was death by unexplained causes. Very clever. As she would lower us into this grave, Dante, as a token of love, remorse, who knows what, decided to place between this glorious hair of hers and the cheek a book of poems he had just written. It was the only handwritten manuscript. Well, 7 years after her death, Dante himself was in a bad way. He had tried to commit suicide with laudanum, had failed, was taking all sorts of other concoctions, thought he was going blind, had no money, didn't know what to do. One of his friends came over and said, Dante, I've got an idea how you can earn some money. He said, what's that? He said, why don't you get your poems published? That'll earn some money for you. He said, it's not possible. They're buried in Highgate Cemetery with Izzy. Not a problem, we'll get it sorted. They got it sorted. They got an exhumation order, permission to open up this grave. And this is true. One dark October night, 2 men came up here. Dante couldn't bear to be present. And they opened up this grave and they found that book of poems stuck to her withered face with worms in it, prized off, fumigated, published. You can read the poems, please don't, because they're terrible. That is true. What is not true, however, is that when the men opened up this grave, they said all the opium that Lizzie had consumed in the laudanum had not only preserved this glorious hair of hers, but continued to grow after her death and completely filled up the grave. It was probably a great publicity stunt to get the poems published. Anyhow, she's buried here with all of the Rossettis. You'll see all the names here, with the exception of Dante. How come? Well, he'd taken too much of his concoctions whilst visiting a friend in Kent on the east coast, and there he died, and there he's buried. He made no provision to be buried here in Highgate Cemetery. Birchington-on-Sea is where his grave is. All the rest are here. Liz's name is on the horizontal slab at the back. You can see Elizabeth Eleanor. That funny squiggly thing is the IHS monogram, the first 3 letters of the name of Jesus in Greek, Atos Sigma, superimposed on one another. You'll see it all over the place in cemeteries and churches here. And all the names of the other members of the Rossetti family. If you want to take a picture, I'll come out the way. I'll go to the end of the pathway and I'll meet you all